Choosing your flight school is probably one of the most important, but also the most difficult tasks when starting your flying career. I'd even say that it can really make or break your experience as a student pilot. And while I'm by no means an expert, I am a student pilot myself, and I found the perfect flight school for me. A perfect match for me might look different than a perfect match for you. But here are the 6 things that I considered when choosing the flight school for my private pilot license. The first and probably most basic question you have to ask yourself is, what do you want to achieve? Do you just want to do the private pilot license, or do you want to go further? Do you want to add an instrument rating? Do you want to do aerobatics? Or do you eventually want to end up as an airline pilot? These questions are important to ask because there's fundamentally 2 different types of flight schools. They're called differently in different parts of the world, but essentially it comes down to this. On the one hand, you have your local flight school that offers the private pilot license and maybe some add-ons. Maybe the instrument rating, maybe you can do training on tailwheel airplanes, maybe you can even do a commercial pilot license. They have this modular build-up. And on the other hand, you have your integrated flight academies, usually run by major airlines that take you from being a pedestrian to an airline pilot. Now, why is this important? Depending on what you want to achieve, you might want to choose a different type of flight school. And by selecting the correct type of flight school for your goals, you make sure that you can do all of your licenses and ratings at the same flight school. So you avoid switching flight schools halfway through your training. Similarly, you also want to ask whether you can do both your theory training and your practical training at the same flight school. And speaking of the theory, depending on your current circumstances with work, family, what have you, you also want to ask them whether they only offer in-class teaching of the theory, or whether you can also complete the theory training at home with some sort of distance learning. That's the option that I chose because I'm working full-time on the side, and with the distance learning I had the option to learn the theory in the evenings or on weekends, basically whenever I had time in my schedule. Speaking of the time in your schedule, my second point is the availability of aircraft and instructors. Before starting your flight training, you want to ask yourself, how often do you want to fly? And how often can you actually fly? Is that once a week, once every 2 weeks, or maybe every day? And if you can only do once a week, which days? Can you only do Tuesdays because that's your day off from work? Can you only do weekends or evenings? Or maybe it doesn't matter at all because you're freelancing. These questions also tie in a little bit with the type of flight school that you're going to, because local schools usually offer training that you can schedule around your other obligations, while these integrated airline training programs are usually a full-time commitment. But regardless of the type of school you're going to or your availabilities, you want to make sure that there are enough aircraft and enough instructors to accommodate your needs. Because you're gonna have a very hard time if there's 30 students competing for 2 aircraft and 1 instructor. Speaking of aircraft, you also wanna ask what happens when one of them needs unscheduled maintenance. Can you just switch to another aircraft in the fleet and continue as normal? Or does that mean that you're grounded until the aircraft is repaired? Speaking of aircraft repair, my third point is the fleet and maintenance. On the one hand, you want to ask what type of airplanes that they have. I believe it doesn't really matter whether you fly a Cessna or a Piper or a Diamond or whatever have you, but you need to like the aircraft and you need to feel comfortable in it. In other words, would you still fly this aircraft after your training is completed? As a personal example, I train on the Diamond Katana, which is a super cute 2-seater plane, and I absolutely love that thing. But if you're a bit bigger or taller than me, this aircraft might be a bit too small for you. In that case, you might want to go for something slightly bigger, such as Piper Warrior. And this brings me to my next point, which is whether the flight school has different types of aircraft that you can try and see what suits you best. But regardless of whether you end up flying a Cessna or a Piper or a Diamond Katana as I do, a very important point is the maintenance of these aircraft. Are they well maintained? The age of the aircraft doesn't really matter. The one I fly is several years older than me, but it is very well maintained and in great shape and totally safe to fly. Speaking of the maintenance, another crucial aspect is whether you have maintenance on site, because this will determine how quickly an issue can be resolved and the aircraft can enter service again. There have been a few times where I found something during the outside check that just didn't quite look right to me or I wasn't sure about, so I could just walk over to maintenance, ask one of the mechanics there, he came, checked it out, and the issue was resolved within a couple of minutes. But if you don't have that, everything takes a lot longer, and that can substantially slow down your progress. My fourth point is about the airport itself. Are you going to train at a big commercial airport or at a local aerodrome? There's no right or wrong whether you do your training at a controlled airport with tower and ground services, etc., or in an uncontrolled field. I think it largely depends on what you want to do later and where you will usually fly to. However, bigger airports have one drawback, which is that you're not the priority, but the commercial flight is. You also may need to go through security, you may need slots for takeoff and landing, so you're just not as flexible as at a local uncontrolled airfield. Speaking of the airfields, another consideration that might play a role is whether you have a grass runway or a concrete runway. It's good to know how to take off and land on both of them, but I do prefer the concrete runways, and that's because you're again a bit more flexible, as you can also take off after heavy rainfalls when a grass runway is just muddy and not suitable for anything at all. And lastly, what also matters is the location of the airport. Is it close to where you live, or would you need to commute for several hours each time you have a flight lesson? In that same direction, do you need a car to reach the airport, or can you take public transport? Again, there's no right or wrong, but these are just things you should consider. After you have all of this sorted out, one very important factor for most people is cost. And when it comes to costs, there's two aspects you need to consider. The first is the most obvious one, the price tag. How much are they gonna charge you? Here you need to consider aircraft rent, also whether the fuel is already included in the rent or if this will be charged extra, if you only pay for the effective flight time or for the entire duration of your reservation. Next, you have the cost of your instructor. How much do they charge per hour? And finally, also the landing fees at your airport. The second aspect is the paying modality. Do they only charge your actual expenses, or is it an all-in package? And if it's the latter, what is actually included in this all-in package? Because that can vary greatly. Also ask them whether you have to pay everything up front or whether they will charge you with a monthly bill, for example. Speaking about costs, there are also ways to save money. And I'm not talking about going to the cheapest flight school you can find, because this is probably not a good idea. But there are still options to save money. For example, in my flight school, if you're part of the local Aero Club, then you get a 10% discount on aircraft rent and almost 50% discount on the landing fees, which if you sum it up over the long term is a lot of money. But what about if you go to one of these big airline training programs? Usually they're quite expensive. To do this integrated training course with the Lufthansa Group in Switzerland would cost about 120,000 Swiss francs, which is money that most people don't just have sitting around in their bank account. But these flight schools usually offer you financing options, or you may even be eligible for federal subsidies. So these are all options that you need to discuss and look into. And lastly, another point how you can save cost is by being well prepared for each flight lesson, because that will minimize the amount of time your instructor needs to spend explaining things to you. But regardless of the modality of paying and how much they charge you and so on, what is very important to me when it comes to cost is that the flight school is very transparent, open and realistic about it. At the time of this recording, I have a bit more than 39 flight hours, and legally I would need 45 hours to pass my private pilot license. However, I will certainly do more than that. And my instructor was very upfront about this on our first day. He told me that this 45 legal limit is really just the bare minimum and that 50 to 60 hours is much more realistic. And I really appreciated that, because then I know what to expect. And this goes into my sixth and final point, which is the vibe. And I know this sounds very silly because we're talking about all these technical aspects, but you're gonna spend a lot of time, money and energy on your flight training. So you better make sure that your flight school has a friendly and welcoming atmosphere. You need to feel comfortable there. Likewise, you need to get along well with your instructor. You're gonna spend a lot of time together. You may encounter some stressful or even critical situations, so there needs to be a strong foundation of mutual trust and respect. I am very happy with my current flight instructor, and I wouldn't want anyone else. And this is how it should be. Remember that you are the customer of the flight school, so if you don't like your instructor, you can and you should change them. First, I believe that if you don't like the person sitting next to you, that is actually a safety risk in an aircraft. And second, getting your pilot's license should be fun. So you should get along with your instructor. Maybe one way to find out whether you vibe with a certain instructor or not is to take an intro flight, see how you get along, and then you can sign up with them or with someone else. And that's my list. I know that I asked more questions than I answered in the end, but choosing a flight school is ultimately a very personal decision. So I can't make it for you. What works for me may not work for you. And that's why I'm curious. What is the most important thing to you when choosing your flight school? Do you agree with my points? Let me know in the comments down below, and see you in the next one. Bye.